Welcome to the Alt Shift Book Club. This is a show where we take a short story or a book chapter or something, and we try and figure out what it means and how it gets its ideas across. This show is different to Alt Shift X. Alt Shift X is very researched and objective and scripted and tightly edited, but this show is just me talking about something I love. I'm not an authority, this is mostly my dumb opinion, so please correct me when I'm wrong. I want to hear your ideas in like the YouTube comments, or maybe we'll make a subreddit or do a live stream or something. It'd be really cool to get discussion happening around these stories. But today we're talking about a story called At the Auction of the Ruby Slippers, which was published in 1994 by Salman Rushdie, who's a super famous author man who's written lots of books and short stories. He's been knighted by Queen Elizabeth. He's had an assassination order put on his head by the supreme leader of Iran. So point being, this guy's been around, he's seen some shit, and he's written some really great stuff. Apparently. I haven't actually read much of his stuff, but there is this one short story that I love a lot called At the Auction of the Ruby Slippers. The story is set in this crazy, chaotic, dystopian future where reality's like collapsing in on itself. The ruby slippers of the title are a reference to The Wizard of Oz, that movie from 1939 with like the yellow brick road and we're off to see the wizard and you know all that. The ruby slippers that Dorothy wears in the movie, the ones that she taps her heels together and says there's no place like home, and that transports her back to her home. This story is about the auction of those slippers, which is an auction that apparently actually took place in 1970. But Salman Rushdie takes like a fictionalized version of that auction and puts it in this fictional future. And he uses it as a way to explore meaning and hope in a crazy, chaotic world. So, to explore how he does that and what he's trying to get across, we're going to go through the story bit by bit and analyze what it's saying. If you want to read the story beforehand, there's an Amazon link in the description. It's in the short story collection East West by Salman Rushdie, but you don't have to read the story to follow the podcast. So, the first paragraph starts up by describing this auction of the slippers that's going to happen. And we're told that people rarely venture out of their bunkers these days. Apparently in this future society, people are living in bunkers, so it's beginning to hint that this is a dangerous, unstable, tense world that we're living in. But people were tempted out from their bunkers by this prize, the ruby slippers. The people in this world care and desire these slippers a lot. And they describe the auction room having notable personages, very important people are coming here. So this is a very unequal society where status matters a lot. Some people are more important than others, and high feelings are anticipated. And so they've got special facilities here, including psychiatrists of varying disciplines located in neo-Gothic confessional booths. So the confessional booths in Catholicism are like those little special rooms where you go and tell the priest about all your sins and who diddled who, whereas psychiatrists are like a modern scientific way to give people peace of mind and to heal people's mind frames. So you've got a modern scientific method contrasted with an ancient religious method. And it's neo-Gothic as well, whereas, Gothic is like that architectural style with all those elaborate stonework on those old churches, but neo-Gothic, so it's like new Gothic. So the point of this is that, like, there's a whole lot of different philosophies and cultures mishmashed together in this future world. I think a good word for this is syncretism. It's syncretic, meaning there's a mishmash of ideologies and philosophies that creates this chaotic world. And that's something that develops more and more throughout this story. It's also mentioned that there are cuspidors, which are spittoons located around. And the reason for that is because everybody is sick these days. Most of us nowadays are sick. So this first paragraph establishes this world as a dangerous, unstable, unequal, hierarchical, syncretic, sick world. That's the world we're entering in this story. And so high feelings are expected. This is a big emotional event, the sale of the slippers. And so they're anticipating psychic fallout. They're expecting an insanity overspill. So that's why they've got all these psychiatrists and these confession booths. They've also got obstetricians and SWAT teams, just in case there are unexpected births or deaths. They have a supply of straitjackets in case of madness. So this is like an extreme, like fantastical level of emotion and tension that's happening in this event. And in the middle of all this chaos and this brewing storm of insanity that's rising up, there are the ruby slippers sparkling behind bulletproof glass. And the people are peering down on these ruby slippers and they're wondering at its powers. They believe that these slippers have unlimited powers. But of course, it's never really explained what those powers are. Like the One Ring, this is something that people are projecting their meanings onto, but we'll get to that. So some of the people at this auction include movie stars. And the movie stars move around and walk with these auras that they have. And these auras, they're not metaphorical auras, these are literal auras. These movie stars have glowing golden, platinum shapes, surrounding them, a fog of color that's surrounding them. They have a literal, physical, visible aura around them, which has apparently been produced in collaboration with masters of applied physics. So again, like physics being a very rational, scientific, modern discipline, but an aura is a very mystical, new age, spiritual sort of an idea. So more of that syncretic mishmash of ideas. And we're told that if any of the common people, if any normal people accidentally knock into one of the movie stars' auras, that person gets knocked to the ground by the security team and hustled out to be carted away. So again, this is a very unfair, unequal society where some people are treated much worse than others, depending on status. So everyone's looking at these ruby slippers behind the glass, and some memorabilia junkie comes up and she kisses the transparent glass around the slippers, which sets off a security system which electrocutes her through her lips, 100,000 volts of electricity, which instantly kill her. The words are that it terminates her interest in the proceedings, which is an incredibly cold, dehumanizing way to describe a human death. It also mentions that the woman's lips are collagen implanted, as though plastic surgery has been done, which I think further alludes to this sort of glamorous, superficial society that's being hinted at. And after that first woman dies, another person runs up and kisses the glass, knowingly killing himself, having just seen the woman die. Apparently this man was the first woman's lover, and so this is a suicidal act of devotion. So these two people just die in the middle of the auction floor, and all the people standing around, they put perfumed handkerchiefs over their noses so they don't have to smell the burning corpse, and they wonder at the mysteries of love. So the people in the auction room act like they care about, love and art and meaning, but they clearly don't care much about human life. We're also told that the cult of the ruby slippers is here. So there's a whole bunch of people at the auction who are basically cosplaying as Wizard of Oz characters. There's lots of wizards and lions and scarecrows around, but not many tin men because that costume's uncomfortable. There's an entire corner of the room occupied by Totos, the little dog that Dorothy has in The Wizard of Oz, and several of these dogs are copulating enthusiastically, and so a janitor has to separate the dogs that are having sex to avoid giving public offense. The man does this with great delicacy and taste. So, again, this society cares very much about, appearance and glamour and everything looking nice, but they don't care as much about actual human life. The next paragraph says that we, the public, are easily, lethally offended. They think of offense as a fundamental right. They value very little more highly than their rage, which gives them moral high ground and allows them to attack their enemies. And I think if, anyone's been on Twitter lately, the idea of an outrage culture seems pretty prescient. And Salman Rushdie is personally familiar with this idea of lethal outrage, because after he published his book, The Satanic Verses, and the Supreme Leader of Iran put a fatwa on his head, people died. There were riots, and there were bombings, and the Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses was murdered. Rushdie himself had to live under police protection for years and years, so Rushdie is very personally familiar with outrage and its consequences. And we're told that people are literally drooling as they are looking on at these slippers. Literal pools of saliva are forming underneath people who are staring at the ruby slippers, and a Latino janitor has to mop up the saliva. The fact that the janitor's Latino might again allude to inequality. We then get a description of why these people care so much about the slippers. The slippers represent the miraculous in a universe that is Nietzschean and relativistic. It also mentions behaviorist philosophers and quantum scientists around the magic shoes. So Nietzschean and relativistic are both some pretty big words. I'm not going to pretend to be able to offer a concise, informed summary of what Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy was. He had a bunch of different ideas, but I think one of his most relevant ones is the idea of perspectivism, which connects to this idea of relativism, both of which are basically saying that there are lots of different perspectives on what's true and what's right, and none of them are really necessarily totally objectively true. In a world where there are all these different perspectives, things all feel basically subjective and arbitrary and then maybe meaningless. A lot of people interpret Nietzsche's philosophy as being nihilistic, and some people disagree. I think Nietzsche might disagree, but I think what this sentence is trying to get at is that in a world that has quantum scientists and magic and religion and psychiatry and all these different perspectives and cultures and ideas clashing together, nothing seems objectively right. Everything's just opinion. Everything's just this timey-wimey, quantum, God is dead, nihilistic, postmodern chaos. I think the moment when I felt that feeling was when recently I looked at the TV and saw on an American cable news channel, NBA player Dennis Rodman was offering to help President Donald Trump make peace with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un in order to avert nuclear apocalypse. And Dennis was weeping, and he was wearing a t-shirt that said potcoin.com because Dennis was promoting his cryptocurrency, which is based on cannabis for some reason. And just that feeling of the being lost in this just swirling, disorienting chaos of different cultural and political and ideological ideas all just sort of swirling together in a way that just made me question what is true and real. That, I think, maybe, is the feeling that Salman Rushdie is trying to get across through his description of this chaotic, postmodern, Nietzschean, relativistic universe. We get more description of what the outside world is like. Apparently, there are people living in subterranean hollows where there are bazookas and Uzi-armed gangs high on drugs and smugglers and burglars. And a whole bunch of homeless people come into the auction room and start rubbing shoulders with the A-list celebrities and eating sushi off the fancy waiters. But the security team turns up and removes the tramps, clubs them into unconsciousness, and dumps them out in a smoking no man's land for them to be consumed by wild dogs, because these are uncompromising times. The wasteland outside is surrounded by giant advertising billboards. So this is a vision of an extreme capitalist future dystopia. We meet a bunch of political refugees at the auction, described as conspirators, deposed monarchs, defeated factions, poets, and bandit chieftains. And these political people wear silken jackets and Japanese pantaloons, and the women wear toreador jackets, like matador jackets, that have sequined representations of great works of art, including Guernica and the disasters of war. Guernica is a painting by Picasso, and it's like an anti-war painting. It's this black and white chaos of just like these faces of animals and people who are engaged in just violence and suffering and injury and agony, and it's just this horrifying nightmare that just represents the horror of violence and war. And the disasters of war is a Spanish piece which also represents a time of war, and it shows violence and like the human consequences of violence. So these are really like disturbing pieces of art that these political refugees are wearing on their bodies. But the artworks are depicted in sequins, glittering sequins. So again, there's this bizarre tension of like horror and glamour at the same time. People take these artworks outside of their context and outside of their meaning in a way that makes them feel superficial. And the political refugees themselves come off as like these ridiculous characters because they're huddling in small hissing bunches, throwing spitballs and paper darts at each other. So the political refugees come off as petty and ineffectual. Politics seems irrelevant and ridiculous in this future. We then get more description of what the slippers mean to the people who are here. Apparently they believe that the slippers will make them invulnerable to witches, because there are so many sorcerers nowadays. They have powers of reverse metamorphosis, an affirmation of a lost state of normalcy, in which we have almost ceased to believe. So the slippers to these people represent like this longing for some kind of home and some kind of place of feeling that everything's okay. Something that they're reaching for that may not even really exist. It kind of interests me, this idea of nostalgia, given that, like, for example, apparently the most popular high-selling video game console of 2017 was the NES Classic, which is a recreation of a Nintendo system from the 80s. So obviously there is a strong sense today for like nostalgia, a longing for a lost state of normalcy. Even the political slogan, "Make America Great Again," it's all about reaching for some kind of past without ever really defining what and where that past was. The people at the auction are trying to reclaim something that they lost, but it's not really clear what that is. The next paragraph mentions religious fundamentalists who disapprove of the fetishizing of the slippers, this consumerist fetishization of these objects as though they could mean something real. And the auctioneers allow the religious fundamentalists to be here because they have money, and money insists on democracy. The auctioneers say that, well, tolerance is important. We must tolerate even the intolerant, as long as they've got money. It's mentioned that these religious fundamentalists stand on soapboxes that are constructed of special sanctified wood, which is a funny tension because soapboxes are meant to be like this makeshift platform that you just find somewhere, some old box that no one's needing. It costs nothing. That's the point of a soapbox, and yet these boxes are constructed of special sanctified wood, which sounds, special and important and expensive. So it's a kind of false humility. And yeah, obviously there's a deep hypocrisy in that the auctioneers allow the religious fundamentalists because they have money, but they don't allow those hobos and tramps who were violently beaten out of the room. So there's a false equality in this capitalistic world. So there are orphans at the auction, and they hope that the ruby slippers might transport them through time as well as space. The text says that, well, our equations prove that all space machines are time machines as well. So that refers back to this quantum general relativity physics concept of time dilation, which is the terrifying real-world fact that time is not simply this straightforward linear thing. It's actually changed and warped by gravity and by velocity. time changes if you move faster. There's that thing about those like astronauts who are twins, where like one astronaut goes on the International Space Station for a while, then comes back to Earth, and the one that was in space is now older or younger than the one who stayed on Earth, because the speed of orbiting the Earth made him experience time differently. Maybe the details might be wrong, but the point is that it's true that time is wibbly-wobbly and not straightforward, and it's relativistic, and it's affected by motion and gravity, which again I think contributes to this sense of people being unmoored in a chaotic, confusing, relativistic world. But it also explains why these orphans hope that maybe if the ruby slippers can transport us to another place, maybe they can transport us back in time when our parents were still alive. So there's a poignant longing for these orphans who want their parents back. And there's also mention of people of dubious character who are dealt with harshly by the security. So again, there's a lot of status and hierarchy in this society. We're told that the people are hoping for home. This is a scattered, damaged concept, but they are yearning for home. They want to follow the rainbow back to home, just like Dorothy does in The Wizard of Oz. But the people are a little bit scared and worried that maybe it's asking too much of these slippers. Maybe it won't give them what they want, and yet they seem to have faith that these slippers are their best hope for meaning. And then the story really ratchets things up a bit metaphysically by introducing the presence of imaginary beings. There are children out of 19th century Australian paintings in the room. There's a literary character, and there's mention of a frail alien creature with an illuminated fingertip, which sounds suspiciously like E.T. There are fictional people and characters entering the real world. The sentence is, "This permeation of the real world by the fictional is a symptom of the moral decay of our post-millennial culture." So what this means is that in this crazy, chaotic, relativistic world where physics and ethics are so mishmashed and all over the place, reality itself is giving way and collapsing, and even the fictional and the unreal is becoming real, and vice versa. Heroes are stepping off of movie screens and marrying members of cinema audiences. And Rushdie ties this into the idea of migration, which is something that he constantly writes about. He says that a large majority of us in this world oppose the free, unrestricted migration of imaginary beings into an already damaged reality. And we're also told that at the same time that fictional people are coming into the real world, some real people are traveling into a fictional world, which I think is also very relevant to 2018. I think there are increasing numbers of people who are choosing to exist in fiction and false realities instead of the real world. There is a new World of Warcraft DLC coming out soon, I believe, and virtual reality technology is becoming more and more sophisticated and to some alluring. So I think we are living in a world where fiction is something that people are exiting the real world to immerse themselves in. But in this world, there's also the fictional coming into reality, which the protagonist ties into his own life. So the protagonist, who we don't really know anything about, tells us about his cousin Gale. And Gale is, of course, the surname of Dorothy Gale, who's the protagonist of The Wizard of Oz. And apparently Gale and the protagonist were lovers, even though Gale is his cousin, so incest, why not? And Gale apparently was very loud when she and the protagonist were making love. She would shout, "Home, boy, home, we're going home." And the protagonist assures us that apart from that loudness, their relationship had nothing abnormal about it, nothing fictional. It reminds me of the Dursleys in Harry Potter saying, "Nothing unusual, perfectly normal." So the people in this world, I think, are trying to cling to a sense of normalcy. They're living in a chaotic world, and so they try to cling to the idea of social norms to feel secure amongst all the chaos. So the protagonist had this relationship with his cousin Gale until he came home one day and found her in the arms of a hairy escapee from a caveman movie. So, a fictional character from a movie came out and stole his girlfriend, basically, which is funny, but also connects back to migration and people's fear of migration, because I think it is this deep-set fear that a lot of people have that hairy, ugly men from another country are going to come and steal our women. I think that's a primordial concern. So Rushdie is reflecting on real world migration here. But the protagonist breaks up with Gale after this, and he leaves with a collection of old Pat Boone records. I don't really. Pat Boone was like a '50s singer. I don't really know his cultural significance, but I'm sure he represents nostalgia to this protagonist. And so after the protagonist broke up with Gale, he was very bitter, and he revealed to his social circle that she had lost her virginity at the age of 14 in an accident involving a defective shooting stick. So it sounds like Gale accidentally had her hymen broken by some object, and that represents, some kind of shame to have symbolically lost her virginity in that way, which is a very medieval, prudish idea, right? Of the purity of a woman being connected to the intactness of her hymen. So I think that's another representation of, this world is trying to cling to these old-fashioned, prudish social norms and values as a way of feeling more secure and ordered in a insecure, unordered world. And so the protagonist, despite all of his bitterness, he still longs for Gale, and he has a candle at her temple. He sort of deifies and mythologizes Gale to the point where he says that the Gale that I adore is not entirely a real person. The real Gale has become confused with my reimagining of her. The real Gale may by now be beyond our grasp, ineffable. So the protagonist mythologizes this woman who he lost. In his longing for connection and meaning and security, he creates this image that's unreal and unachievable and ridiculous, and so he can't ever get what he invented, what's a fiction. And he went out to a bar recently, a bar which is subterranean and which is guarded by freelance commandos bearing battlefield nuclear weapons. So more of the dystopia. There's also reference of the pretty good beers Kirin and Tsingtao. But the point is that Gale is at the bar and she's watching the TV. And on the TV, there's an astronaut stranded on Mars. Apparently, this world had a space exploration project to Mars, put some people on Mars, but then they had to abruptly cancel the space exploration budget for some reason, and they couldn't bring this astronaut back home. They left him on Mars to die, and now the television is beaming in real time the slow, sad death of this human astronaut on Mars. His slow descent into despair, his low-gravity, weight-reduced death. So this, I think, is reminiscent of reality TV. There's a lot, and the news, like when we turn on news broadcasts of foreign wars and disasters and poverty, I think Rushdie's trying to show us the perversity and the wrongness of watching people suffer and doing nothing, only just being sort of vaguely titillated. Maybe a recent example is those Thai boys who were stuck in that cave. All of them survived, luckily, but, they very easily couldn't have, and there have been many times when things, have gone badly and there's been deaths on the news and people have just sort of sat and watched, just like this world is watching this astronaut dying on TV. And while Gale watches the astronaut on TV, the protagonist watches Gale. She has become his chosen program. And the astronaut on the TV is singing songs to himself, songs from The Wizard of Oz. And the protagonist thinks it sounds like Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey, singing Daisy, Daisy. And by the way, this whole idea of a human astronaut being stranded on Mars, they call him the Martian, which is, reminiscent of the recent movie and book The Martian, which is about the same thing, a human stuck on Mars. I'll note that was written after this story came out. But I suppose neither was the first. Anyway, so Gale starts crying watching the astronaut, and the protagonist does not go across to comfort her. So the protagonist has a chance, an opportunity at actual human connection. He could comfort his former lover and attempt to reconnect. But I think part of why he doesn't do that is because he has this mythologized, fictionalized version of Gale in his head to which she could never live up. So I guess Rushdie's saying that in a way it's the extremeness and the height of our dreams and fictionalizations that prevent us from actually having real connections. And then, the next morning, the protagonist decides that he wants to buy the ruby slippers, and that's why he's at the auction now. And his plan is that the protagonist wants to bring the ruby slippers to Gale and offer them to her, and to suggest that she should use the ruby slippers that can transport people through space to go to Mars, and for Gale to bring the spaceman back to Earth. Which is this beautifully, syncretic, maybe, idea of this magical pair of shoes going off to rescue an astronaut from Mars, which is a very sort of, science-y idea next to the magical. But what this really means to the protagonist, these slippers represent, they're a reminder of his wasted love with Gale. There's no place like home. So, at this bar, instead of just talking to the woman he's longing for, he ends up using this ridiculous, fantastical plan of using these magic slippers to go to Mars, and that's how he wants to win back his love, instead of just talking to her. The dream gets in the way of the reality. And the protagonist addresses us, breaks the fourth wall, and says, "You laugh at my desperation? Go tell a drowning man not to clutch at straws. Go ask a dying astronaut not to sing." He compares himself to the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz and says, "Put 'em up, I'll fight you, with one hand tied behind my back. I'll fight you." So our protagonist, comparing himself to the cowardly lion, makes these absurd threats of violence, which are obviously coming from a place of insecurity and terror. And maybe seeing, that being the motivation for his violence, we can recontextualize the violence against, like the hobos and stuff before. Maybe part of the reason why this society is a violent society is because it's a scared, insecure society that's just trying to defend itself and ultimately trying to find meaning. So we get more description of the sale room of the auctioneers. We're told that it's the beating heart of the earth. This world revolves around the capitalistic sale of things. And we're told that some of the things that have been sold at this sale room include the Taj Mahal, the Statue of Liberty, the Sphinx, and the Alps. They have sold wives and husbands, they have sold state secrets, and at one point they sold a wide selection of human souls to an interdenominational bunch of demons. So this is like a extreme satire of like capitalism. Like, this is metaphysical level neoliberalism. If consumerism keeps on becoming more and more extreme, maybe we'll get to the point where we are buying and trading human souls. Everything is for sale, the text says. And this appeals to the people in this world. The protagonist says there is a purity about our actions here. We take the vast complexity of all the life that turns up, and we have a simple system for dealing with them, which is buying and selling through monetary value. And I think that anyone who's a fan of Excel spreadsheets, anyone who likes math, anyone who's played Factorio might be able to appreciate the satisfaction of a simple algorithmic system applying order to the complex, which, can be great. But this paragraph's getting at how wrong that can be. It can be dehumanizing. It can wipe away nuance to apply a simplistic, cold system to the complex, chaotic real world. So I think this is questioning the very sort of systematic, ordered approach to life. In the next paragraph, the auction starts. They are now bidding for the slippers. But the protagonist takes us on a weird tangent about something that happened to him once, where there was this pop singer who died, and the husband of the dead pop singer asked the protagonist to go to an auction of memorabilia of the pop singer, and they sell these edible panties that the pop singer wore on stage and would throw into the crowd. And the protagonist doesn't end up buying them because the price gets too high. And the protagonist calls up the widower, the husband, and says, sorry, I didn't buy the panties. And the guy asks how much they sold for, and the protagonist says it's this really high amount of money, and the husband laughed. It was the first genuinely joyful laugh that the protagonist had heard from him. And then he said that, well, that's all right then, because I've got 300,000 of those. So that's a weird tangent. I'm not really sure what the point of that's meant to be. I mean, it's obviously weird and gross that the thing that makes the husband happy is how much his dead wife's panties sold for. That's like a really weird, dehumanizing thing where he values his wife based on the amount of money that she was associated with. And I suppose that might be all that paragraph means, is how, I don't know, capitalism is dehumanizing, but maybe someone has a better interpretation than that. But anyway, we're told that it is to the auctioneers we go to establish the value of our pasts, of our futures, of our lives. So it's about how fucked up capitalism is. And back in the present, the auction is happening, and a lot of the people bidding are proxies, people who are bidding for other people. And the protagonist says that he himself is so often a proxy in so many ways. They also hear an explosion outside, but everyone ignores it because they're absorbed by a higher drama. So I think both these lines represent how the people in this world are disconnected from reality. And apparently the emotions are running high because the psychiatrist's booths have long queues outside of them, and order is maintained by the guards, and everything's getting crazy and tense, and the protagonist feels that he is doing battle with an invisible world of demons and ghosts, and the prize is his lady's hand. So this guy is immersed in this fantasy of what's going on, and he feels like he's in battle with all of these invisible forces, which to me represents or evokes some of the things that happen on the internet these days. Internet trolls that, may or may not be influencing political elections. There are corporations now that exist on Twitter as though they were humans. Like, did you see Wendy's put out a mixtape? The world is increasingly run not by people who and local communities. It's affected by these broad, capitalistic, cultural, technological, political forces which none of us can really directly see or understand. And I think that's evoked by this protagonist's description of this invisible world of demons and ghosts. The protagonist gets more and more emotional. He feels like he is detached from the earth. He becomes immersed in fictions. He says, "In fiction's grip, we may mortgage our homes, sell our children to have whatever it is that we crave. Alternatively, in that miasmal ocean, we may simply float away from our desires and see them anew from a distance so that they seem weightless, trivial. We let them go. Like men dying in a blizzard, we lie down in the snow to rest." So, and then the protagonist says that at that point, his cousin Gail loses her hold over him, and he wakes up feeling refreshed and free, and he no longer cares about Gail. So that kind of sounds like a good thing. Our protagonist feels free, but he became free by stopping caring about his human connection with Gail, and he achieved that by immersing himself in the capitalistic, false, fictional world of the auction room. So it's a very false positive ending. There's a little more weird stuff tacked on the end about there's another auction coming up next week, and they are selling royal dynasties and lineages, and you can insert your own name into any royal dynasty you choose, which I think represents, the breakdown of authenticity and realness and truth. If everything's for sale, nothing really sort of means anything if anything can be bought. But the protagonist says that the point of this whole system is that we keep on longing to be something, and we fear that we are not something. We want to be somebody. So I think what this story is about is the search for meaning and identity and security in an unstable, chaotic, unequal world. You got the rational clashing with the magical. There's a sense that there's no objective truth. Everything's timey-wimey, relativistic. It's a chaotic, postmodern mess. Money and status and glamour is destroying authenticity and truth, making people cold and brutal. And in their search for meaning, people turn to fictions and mythologizations and deifications and like heightening, creating these impossible visions of what they want, which only separates them further from the possibility of real human connection. So this story came out in 1994, but I think, to me at least, this seems super relevant to 2018 in an age of political chaos and insecurity and truth threatened on social media and a growing sense of uncertainty and anxiety, I think. So that is At the Auction of the Ruby Slippers. I think that's what it's about. And I love the way it uses the fantastical and the funny and ridiculous to illustrate what's most horrifying about the 21st century. I'm sure there's a lot of other perspectives you could take on this story. I know that there's a lot of ideas about migration that are probably relevant here. That is something that Salman Rushdie writes about a lot. And obviously, you know, the themes of The Wizard of Oz could be analyzed a lot more in relation to the story, I think. I'm sure there's also someone who could define Nietzschean a lot more clearly than I did. So if you do have thoughts and ideas on this story, I'd love to hear them in the YouTube comments or whatever else we set up. And I'd also like to hear whatever ideas you guys have for the next story to cover. I'd like to focus on short stories for now, I think, but like, you know, we could do poems and book chapters and, you know, maybe movies and stuff even. Whatever ideas you have, I'd love to hear them. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Let us know what you think of this episode. We'll do more if you like it. It'd be cool to release this as a podcast. We might do it monthly or so. But this is just a pilot episode. This is a trial run. So we'll see how this goes. And thank you for watching. Cheers.